according to airspaceMag.com. First, they tried an F-104, not enough wing or thrust, recalls Jack Petrie, a retired U.S. Air Force colonel. When NASA engineers were launching rockets at Florida's Cape Canaveral in the 1960s, they needed pilots to fly close enough to film the missiles as they accelerated through Mach 1 at 35,000 feet. Petrie was one of the chosen, and the preferred chase airplane was the McDonnell F-4 Phantom. Those two J-79 engines made all the difference, says Petrie. After a Mach 1.2 dive sync to the launch countdown, he walks the rocket's contrail up to the intercept, tweaking closing speed and updating mission control while camera pods mounted under each wing shot film at 900 frames per second. Matching velocity with a Titan rocket for 90 extreme seconds, the Phantom powered through the missile's thundering wash, then broke away as the rocket surged toward space. Of pacing a Titan II in a two-seat fighter, Petrie says, "Absolutely beautiful. To see that massive thing in flight and be right there in the air with it, you can imagine the exhilaration." For nearly 4 decades of service in the U.S. military, the Phantom performed every combat task thrown at it, almost every mission ever defined. All we had to work with at the beginning was a gleam in the customer's eye, said James S. McDonnell of the Phantom's inception. In 1954, the ambitious founder of McDonnell Aircraft personally delivered to the Pentagon preliminary sketches based on the U.S. Navy's request for a twin-engine air superiority fighter. The Navy green-lighted McDonnell's concept, as well as a competing offer from Chance Vaught that updated the F-2 Crusader. "We fired 2 sidewinders at the trailing MiG," he says. "One hit him, and he dropped out of the fight. De Bellevue couldn't see that the enemy had in fact crashed and burned, officially making him an ace. But the other guy was turning hard into us anyway, so we put all our attention on him," he says. The F-4 launched a heat seeker, which immediately soared out of sight. "It looked like it was heading for the sun, which isn't good news," he says. "Even from the back seat, I could see the MiG, and by this time he was really making angles on us." A streak entered his field of view. The errant Sidewinder had rejoined the battle. It ended up in the MiG's afterburner. "He rolled out wings level, and then rolled inverted," says de Bellevue, of the MiG's pilot. "He was at about 12 or 1,500 feet when he started a split S. The first 90 degrees was perfect. After that he turned to dust." Even as he was being toasted at the officers' club the night of his 5th and 6th victories, they handed me transfer papers and told me to be ready to leave at 6 the next morning, he says. The Air Force removed aces from combat. Stateside, after graduating from pilot training, he was soon in the Phantom again, this time the front seat. When he retired from the Air Force 26 years later, Chuck de Bellevue was the last American ace on active duty. Jim Schreiner had flown Air Force A-10s and was facing a desk job in 1990 when he was offered one more flying tour. He suggested a General Dynamics F-16 or a McDonnell Douglas F-15, the elite fighters at the time. In his book Magnum, The Wild Weasels in Desert Storm, co-authored with Brick Eisel, he described his assignment flying 1969 vintage F-4Gs instead. "It was still a fighter," he says today, "but not exactly what I was thinking of." "20 years after Sam's downed more than 200 American warplanes in Vietnam, Wild Weasel pilots like Schreiner flew upgraded Phantoms into SAM-filled skies during Operation Desert Storm in January 1991. This time, the outcome was very different. Not a single U.S. aircraft was downed by an Iraqi radar-guided SAM. The Wild Weasel F-4s were fitted with an APR-47 radar homing and warning system, which enabled them to sniff out missile sites. Also, the backseat configuration was altered to accommodate additional radar scopes and inertial navigation equipment. The Weasel's most pertinent weapons were 2 or 4 AGM-88 high-speed anti-radiation missiles, designed to follow the SAM radar beam right back to its origin. Half of a 2-aircraft mission quickly found the Iraqi SAM sites. Early on, North Vietnamese SAM operators who had connected the dots, energized radar equals missile exploding through the roof, and learned to keep their radar power down until the last moment before launch. The Iraqis hadn't yet figured out that it wasn't a good idea to have the sights up, says Schreiner. So they had them all turned on. The result was a target-rich environment, says Schreiner. Lots of things to look at and shoot at. In the cockpit, he watched as each anti-radiation missile found its mark, and the icon representing a SAM site on the Phantom's radar screen was replaced by a symbol indicating where it used to be. Air-to-air threats were a non-issue. AIM-7 Sparrows carried for self-defense were never used. There was never any reason to, says Schreiner. Had there been any threat, we had plenty of F-15s in the air to take those out. None of the Wild Weasels were hit by anything larger than small-caliber ground fire. We continued to fly until they called a halt to the air war, says Schreiner. At 2 a.m. on the first night of the war, Schreiner and his backseater, Dan Sharp, won. Yes, 68,000 is well above the F-4's operating range, says Jack Petrie. We weren't supposed to go above 50, so we didn't tell anybody. That day in January 1965, while he and his backseater, Captain Ray Seal, were chasing the Titan II rocket, their Phantom smash flight energy pushed the space program's comfort zone. In his helmet headset, Petrie could hear that the range controller at Cape Canaveral was getting nervous. Break it off, the controller repeated. Negative, Petrie replied, assuring the controller that his finite momentum wouldn't mess with the missile. The whole idea was to keep the airplane pointed at the missile, he says. So we stayed with it just as long as we had the airspeed to keep the cameras rolling. For a fleeting moment, his altimeter eclipsed 68,000 feet. We had virtually no energy left, says Petrie. We weren't flying anymore at that point, just riding. But the F-4 stayed quite stable. The Titan leaned into its trajectory and barreled downrange. Petrie broke away, inverted, and maneuvered to restore airflow over the wings. He and his backseater kept Gemini 2 in the F-4's camera sights, he says, until we fell out of the sky.